actually have no idea what you're doing when you are discussing the problem of evil, and that is okay. That's why I'm making this video. The topic of today's video is going to be about motivation versus justification. I love this aspect of the topic because I see this mistake happen a lot, and I'm going to dispel this for you and articulate how you can get a clear understanding of what to do when this happens and when this comes up. So without further delay, let's get into the video. Alrighty, now we are in the virtual whiteboard. I want to talk about something that I see happen a lot, and it's actually a mistake that I don't think individuals are making. I think it's a result of having a lack of clarity around how to navigate the lay of the land, that is these problem of evil or suffering questions and conversations. Sorry for bumping my mic a bit there. I call it the justification versus motivation, or justification motivation conflation problem. Yes, that's right. The justification versus motivation problem. What exactly does that mean? Well, I have it articulated here. If we follow the flow of the whiteboard, it says definition: when someone conflates moral justification with psychological motivations when discussing the problem of evil. Why does this matter? Well, because the problem of evil actually has two stages in it. And if you're familiar with anything having to do with cosmological arguments actually have two stages as well. The first stage is what we call it's actually called stage one. And stage one is moving from some kind of principle about causality or some kind of principle about some explanatory requirement, right? And so if we take the contingency argument, for example, it's going to be about the fact that there is these contingent items of reality, or contingent things that exist that could very much have been otherwise or not even existed at all. And we're trying to move from that kind of feature of reality to a terminus for that explanation. And that is what our explanatory principle, or our causal principle, is trying to do. That gets us to then stage two, which is, okay, let's say in contingency arguments, it's going from contingency to necessity. There's some kind of necessary foundation, necessary item, maybe group of necessary things, or we can call it a system or network. And then it's trying to identify in stage two, on the theist end, whether that should be properly or can even be properly identified as God. So stage two is moving from necessity to God. Specifically in the contingency argument sense. There's many other cosmological arguments out there. It's a whole family or a group of arguments, but they share a common structure, a common logic. In the same way, when it comes to problem of evil discussions, there are two stages. The first one is the justification stage. And the justification stage, or phase as I like to call it, I actually took the word phase from Dr. Trent Doherty's work, where he actually puts this into what he calls the negative phase and the positive phase of theodicy. The justification phase is very different than the motivations phase. So let's move along with the flow here. What is the difference then between justification and motivation? Well, we have it outlined right here for us. Moral justification refers to the ethical grounds an agent has for performing some action, whereas motivation refers to the desires an agent has that leads them to perform some action. These are not the same. These have never been the same. And when we are having discussions, alright, so I know these concepts might be a little new, or you're still trying to digest them, and that is perfectly fine. That's why I have an option for you that if you want a little bit of more hands-on help and guidance for how to navigate these ideas, click the link in my description as well as the comments, and I will reach out to you within 24 hours of doing so to see if I can help you. I often see about the problem of evil, arguments from evil, is what I often see is people will say, they'll ask the question, well, how or why would God, and they'll either use the language of allow or permit, or they would use kind of world creation language, like why would God create a world where there's suffering? Notice how there's almost like a philosophical sleight of hand happening. I'm not even calling it this malice. I'm not even saying this is intentional. I don't think most people are intentionally noticing that they're conflating the two concepts here. But when you talk about allowance language, in ethics, there is this normative theory called deontology. And in ethics, we have a logic for reasoning within this system of deontology. We call it deontic logic. Okay? It's just the logic of deontology. It's the logic around how do we use this language. Deontology is a theory about normative ethics, these guiding principles that tell us when an action is right or when an action is wrong. And deontology will tell us, and they will use language like permissible. It'll use language like ought, obligated, obliged, things like that, as well as forbidden. Okay? So permissibility, obligation, oughts, and forbiddenness, that is the language of deontology. And so when we are talking about why would God allow, that's just another way of saying, would God permit? Now, the reason why I bring up the language of deontology is because it has to do with justification. If something is permissible, it means you aren't doing anything wrong or you aren't doing anything forbidden. Okay? If something is morally forbidden, it is absolutely, well, not absolutely, but it is more considered morally wrong. Ethical rightness and ethical wrongness, right? When it comes to moral justification, we are looking towards some theory about the permissibility of an action. What would make this not bad for an agent to do? Whereas motivation, okay, motivation refers to, like, what are my specific desires? What are my specific psychological reasons or makeup that drove me to do something? That's very different than just mere, am I bad for doing an action? If I'm not bad for doing an action, then I am in this permissible range. If I am, it's a completely different question when you ask me, well, why did I do something? And when people ask, well, why would God create a world with suffering? What they're asking is they're more so using the language that actually aligns with this. Now, they may mean justification over here, but they're using the language of motivations, okay? And so I've found this helpful that when I'm in conversations with individuals and I see this conflation happening, and once you understand these two concepts, you're not going to be able to unsee it. I find it helpful to clarify. Okay, what are we talking about? What do we mean? So these are not the same. And what's funny is I came up with this interesting analogy, right? I actually first came up with this idea when I was in my kitchen and I was making espresso. Okay, I love coffee. I love espresso. Okay, shout out to my parents for getting me my espresso machine. Love you guys. And I was making coffee and I said, it'd be so interesting, right? This is how my brain works, right? When you're so steeped in philosophy, your brain kind of just gives you these interesting abstract scenarios. And I was like, what if I was making coffee and my roommate came to me and he said, hey, why are you morally justified in making this shot of espresso? And I was like, okay, that's a really interesting question because that's very different than asking me, why did you make a shot of espresso? Do you see the difference there? If you ask me, am I morally justified for making espresso? Well, the way in which I would answer that question is I would kind of think within a moral framework. I'd be like, well, within this moral framework, am I doing something wrong? Okay, I'm not doing any, at least I don't think I'm doing anything wrong. I hope that the beans were harvested, well. I hope that the people that were harvesting the beans weren't treated ill and everything. Am I contributing to some complex that's, enslaving people? Whatever, right? You can always go down that. But am I in the immediate context? By turning on the machine, making the espresso, am I doing something wrong? And no, I'm not. So I'm actually justified in my actions because I'm within that permissible range. I'm not doing anything wrong. And I may be even doing something right by being justified. But all we need is just to know that I'm not bad. I'm not performing any bad actions by doing so. And so it's interesting. It's like, because we don't think like this. We don't go, like, if someone were to ask you, hey, are you morally justified for filling up that soda for yourself? It'd be like, That's a very weird question because I mean, justifiedness doesn't really tell you too much about the entire situation. It just tells you when you're not doing something bad. And so, within these particular moral constraints and moral strictures, am I doing something wrong? And the answer is, well, plausibly no. I'm not actually doing something wrong here. So I'm justified in making coffee, right? And if you guys disagree, comment down below. I want to see your argument. Why am I not justified? Okay. But anyway, continuing on. Now imagine, right? This our little guy, our little individual here. Imagine if you were to ask me the question, well, why did you make this coffee? Okay, now we're talking about my motivations. Notice how me being just merely and minimally justified in making coffee is does not tell you anything about why I made it or why I desired it or why I was led to pursue it. It doesn't tell you squat about that. And that is the problem with this conflation, is that it doesn't actually tell you what my motivations are. And my motivations I'm going to reference a completely different class of reasons, right? The class of reasons that I will reference are going to be things like, well, I like the taste of coffee. I like the utility of coffee because it has some practical utilities, such as it gives me an energy boost. I like the caffeine. I like the process of making coffee. You know, I'm someone that enjoys just coffee itself. I could even cite my particular habits. I just have a habit of making coffee in the morning. That is a very different way of answering the question. And so, as the flow says here, if you were to cite my exact motivations, that's actually not going to tell you if I'm morally justified or not, but it's going to be based on my particular desires that led me to perform some action. Now, if we think about this question of justification again, even if I give you my motivations first, which is why I say this is actually the second stage or the second phase of the conversation, even if I give you my motivations first, it's not going to tell you anything about this over here about my justification. And that's often what I see in theological conversations. As people will be like, okay, but how are all these interesting soul building goods, valuable connection goods, relationship building goods, aesthetic goods, all the kinds of things that theodicists cite to explain the evils on theism, that always go back to the end of the day, how does that make it okay? How does that make it worth permitting? Or how does it make it permitting at all, right? And it's because we need to actually settle this first part of the stage, which is justification. That's the important piece. And so if we move down to the flow, then it comes down to this. Well, then what are our theories about moral justification? Because we can't move forward. And the theodicy part is happening at the motivations part. Now, you could call this whole entire process and project theodicy, but ultimately, what we're actually doing is we're actually moving from one step to a second step. And it's really the second step, which is this motivations idea, that actually gives it a theodicy, because that's where we start to cite the goods. Remember, theism, and I'm a big Swinburnian. If you guys don't know Richard Swinburne, he is an amazing philosopher who has written many books on defending the existence of God and Christianity, etc., and so forth. I've been really inspired by him. And one of the things that he does is he articulates the fact that all of the reasons we give for God's actions have to be value-laden reasons. Meaning, there has to be some kind of good that is pursuable when we are coming up with a reason. Well, why would God have plausibly or might have done this particular action, performed this particular action, or created this particular thing? And when we are engaging in theodicy, what we're doing is we're just citing the motivations just like that when we're doing natural theology, or we're giving evidence for the existence of God. And so what I want to tell you guys there is that's the theodicy part. But we have to get the floor. We have to get the foundation, which is this moral justification part. Okay, so there's really actually two theses on justification. There is what's called the necessity condition and what is called the defeat condition. Shout out John Schneider for giving me or publishing about those terms. The necessity condition is very simple. It goes as such: an evil is allowable. So we're using that deontic logic language again. An evil is allowable if it is necessary. And then The defeat condition says that an evil is allowable if it has the potential to be defeated. Okay? What does the necessity condition mean in its elaborated form? Necessary to bring about a greater good or to prevent a greater evil. That is what it means. And there are many philosophers who have published on this, such as William Rowe uses this language, Quentin Smith uses this language, Paul Draper uses this language. When we talk about gratuitous evil, it's about this language. Robert Bass uses this language. Marilyn McCord Adams refers to this general idea of understanding in her book, Horrendous Evils and the Goodness of God. It's this language of necessity. Now, notice how this is actually very consequentialist or utilitarian and in its essence. And so it's unsurprising that there's been this big disagreement between theists and atheists about what is actually permissible when it comes to evils, right? And so it's this idea where you're kind of trying to outweigh or off balance, what we call it balancing off, the positive and negative aspects of something happening to somebody, right? So we could say like pleasure is positive and like pain is negative. Let's just say that. Let's use it as our toy model for now. And what we're basically saying is that, well, if there's more negative than positive, like if somebody is, let's say that this represents horrendous suffering on the negative side, but then they get some, like let's say they recover and they get some respite from it, now they're no longer experiencing the pain. Now they're kind of just experiencing like a break from the pain. Let's just say that that's all this positivity means. Yeah, we're going to say that the negativity actually balances off the positivity, and this would just mean that God is just not allowed to permit this suffering because it is just immoral. It is wrong. It is morally incorrect to permit a state of affairs that ends up being like this. That is what this means right here. Okay, but the defeat condition is very different because it views things in terms of the subject. So it's actually agent oriented, or what I like to say, sufferer centric. And the sufferer centric approach basically says that, listen, when we talk about defeat, we are talking about, sure, there's an event that happens to an agent. But what we need to focus on is not merely what happens to an agent or subject. We're actually going to be focusing on what happens to the subject on the entire timeline of their entire life with that evil or event happening to them. Okay, notice what I'm saying, which is we aren't just looking at this single instance, minute, immediate instance of what's happening to them. We're seeing how do we view this evil or this suffering that's befallen this subject with respect to their entire life. And so what the defeat condition basically states is an evil becomes defeated or is defeated when an agent retroactively, so hindsight, looking back perspective, consents to their suffering and deems it as a non-regrettable aspect of a meaningful life story. Notice how I said life story. What I did is I took how Marilyn McCord Adams talks about the defeat condition, how Doherty talks about the defeat condition, Schneider does, and I simplified the language a little bit to make it a bit more accessible and understandable. So it's about the agent's life on what we call on the whole. We have to look at their entire timeline of their life. And we have to see, did that evil contribute to a kind of a domino effect of that person's life where actually on the whole, they actually regret their own existence. Like they actually go, I'm actually worse off on my entire life because of this evil. If a subject actually psychologically concludes that while looking back, and this evil could have taken place years and years and years in the past. That's why it's a retroactive consent. So when an evil is defeated, it's when, hey, the agent looks back and goes, that suffering that happened to me, that was terrible, and I might not even want to go through that again. But given this life that I've been living ever since, I'm able to look at like my entire life, almost think of it as a biography. And I see the evil in context of everything else that's played out. And I actually can see that's contributed to my life being meaningful in many ways. Now, the evil still remains evil in its own right. It never becomes good. But it contributes to their life on the whole, where they go, I actually have lived a meaningful life, and I actually don't regret my life story. And in many ways, I'm actually thankful for it. So now notice what's happening, where the evil is actually no longer leaving any negative impact, lasting negative impact. It has not been permanently soul destroying, right? That is what we're focusing on. And so when we think about things being on the whole, right? Look at these. We have these negative parts with these positive parts, and they can have more negative parts and positive parts, when we look at particular sections of their life. Think about it like a ruler with different ticks on it. But this blue on the outside, which is to represent the whole, this is to represent positivity. If the agent psychologically envisions their life as being positive on the whole, which is my life is actually worth living, I'm actually grateful that I was created. I actually know the love that God has actually given to me, and this evil, it was once bad. Well, it was bad when it happened, but I no longer am affected by that today, and I see how it contributed to my life being meaningful in this way. And the thing is that it's all agent centric. So I can't be the one that tells you how they're going to integrate it into their meaningful life story. That is up to them. And every agent is going to perceive and do that differently. But the idea here is that if the evil is in and of itself, so intrinsically and inherently not cut off from any agent who experiences it to be able to do this positive integration, then God, under this framework of the defeat condition, is morally justified in not preventing it. Think about mosaics. We have mosaics in art, right? And mosaics are built out of minute shards, some rocks, pebbles, glass shards, and everything, and they're fit together in such a way where they compose this beautiful whole. I mean, look at this, right? Look at all the individual little rocks or whatever these things are that make up this beautiful painting. I mean, it's a very interesting work of art, and we would look at this with aesthetic pleasure. And what I love about this is if we were to just zoom in on any one of these, nothing interesting is happening. And some of these, like when look at these black stones, like they're not even good to look at. If we're just to zoom in on it in and of itself, right? You can think about evils being this way, but how they integrate with one another and how they communicate with one another in this network of other ones. When you look at it on the whole, it's actually beautiful, it's actually worthwhile. And so you can think about an agent's life being the same way, where yes, some of these rocks could represent evils, but then it's how the agent integrates it in such a way where then on the whole, it is actually beautiful and it's actually worthwhile. And so that's the idea of the defeat condition. Now notice this is not a theodicy. Please do not go away from this video and telling you that I gave you a theodicy. I just gave you the constraints for moral justification. The theodicy part is going to be based on the motivations, and that's where we go and we cite these goods that come about from why God would create a world where he would not prevent certain instances of suffering. And that is a completely different, that's actually a completely separate conversation. So I want to give that to you guys. I hope this is really, really helpful in how you navigate conversations. I hope this helps in your journey and brings you value. That's always what I desire to do. Catch you guys on the next one. And look at that, you've made it to the end of the video. Give yourself a big pat on the back. Less than 1% of people make it to the end of the videos that they watch. I want you to take action on the things that you've learned today and not just be a knowledge collector. And you can easily do that by subscribing and seeing how these ideas relate into all the other things that are part of a bigger system and whole. And you can do that by watching the rest of my videos. And with that, I'll see you over there.